Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And for the benefit of those who may be listening at home, I'll remind the House the motion that we're debating today, that in the opinion of the House, the government misled Canadians on its platform and throne speech commitment. Quote, that 2015 will be the last federal election conducted under the first-past-the-post voting system, end quote, and that the House call on the government to apologize to Canadians for breaking its promise. It's a simple motion in response to a simple act when they came out last Wednesday and announced that they just simply wouldn't be following through on their commitment. It was a clear commitment, and it clearly demands an apology to this House and to Canadians, Mr. Speaker. I rose in this House last spring on an optimistic note because the government, which had first of all made that commitment in the election, repeated it in its throne speech, then proceeded to drag its heels in getting the process started. Incidentally, later they would argue they didn't have enough time to change the voting system, but they burned up 6 months sitting around to come up with a lame idea, which was just to have an ordinary committee. I mean, how it takes you 6 months to come up with the idea of establishing a regular committee with a government majority, I don't know, Mr. Speaker. Neither did Canadians, neither did the media. That's why it was panned broadly when it came out. And so last spring I was pleased to rise when the government saw fit to act on a good idea, which was the NEP idea to have an all-party committee where they wouldn't have a majority, and it seemed like maybe this was a step forward. Maybe the government actually, after all, was serious about following through on that election commitment and throne speech commitment. So that was an optimistic time, and since then, a lot has happened, and some seemed like we were moving in the right direction, and then there were setbacks. For instance, last October, it felt like a setback when all of a sudden the Prime Minister, who had said many times in this House that 2015 would be the last election under the first-past-the-post system, said in an interview that, quote, under Mr. Harper, there were so many people dissatisfied with the government and its approach that they were saying we need an electoral reform so that we can no longer have a government we don't like. However, under the current system, they now have a government that they're more satisfied with, and the motivation to want to change the electoral system is less urgent. Essentially saying when it works for me, it must be working for Canadians, and when it works for people I don't like, well, then we got a problem. And that felt like a setback. That felt like the Prime Minister was moving away from his commitment. Then later, on December 2nd, hope sprung again, Mr. Speaker, because then the Prime Minister said, I make promises because I believe in them. Okay? He said in Toronto, I've heard loudly and clearly that Canadians want a better system of governance, a better system of choosing our governments, and I'm working very hard so that 2015 is indeed the last election under first-past-the-post. Now, they've since said that there wasn't consensus. That sounds to me like the Prime Minister was saying there is a consensus, that we need to make a change. And when you have that kind of consensus for a change, granted, that's not the same as consensus on a solution, but what people expect from their government is leadership to put forward a proposal that might actually put us forward. We're still waiting on the proposal. They've announced they're not keeping the promise, and we never even heard what their proposal would be, Mr. Speaker. And it surely wasn't for lack of consultation, because members of this House from all sides went out into their own constituencies. They talked to their constituents. The committee traveled across the country and talked to Canadians and talked to experts. Over 80% of the Canadians that spoke to the committee said they wanted a proportional system. Over 90% of the experts said that a proportional system was the best for Canada. And then we heard all sorts of possible solutions and possible voting systems and possible proposals. The government had but to pick one and put it to Canadians. And before they could be bothered to do that, Mr. Speaker, they came out and said that they simply weren't going to go ahead with their promise. And that's pretty sad, particularly coming from a Prime Minister who in the last election said that he was the one that was going to ride on into the House of Commons on his white horse and clean up the cynicism in Canadian politics, and that he would be the one to show Canadians there's a better way, and that he would inspire young people to get involved in politics and to affirm the value of electing different governments because different governments could behave differently. And last Wednesday, and that, believe me, Mr. Speaker, that's not the only example, but last Wednesday was the most cut and dry example of the Prime Minister walking away from that message of hope. And we see it in a week, Mr. Speaker. Well over 90,000 Canadians have signed an online petition calling on the government to keep its promise. And that's not 90,000 people in the rinky-dink way that they set up the My Democracy survey, where we don't know if they live in Canada or we don't know if they signed up many times, because the e-petition system, unlike the government's lame survey, actually has integrity. So we know that that's over 90,000 individual Canadians that have signed that e-petition that are calling on the government to keep its promise. And instead, what are they doing today? Standing up and shamefully saying, not only are we going ahead with breaking that promise, but we don't even have what it takes to apologize for going ahead with that. And then we're told that this is the government that's going to bring an end to cynicism. Well, let's look at their excuses for breaking that promise, Mr. Speaker. At the time that they decided to break it last week, the initial answer was, well, you know, there isn't consensus. And we've certainly heard that from Liberal members here today. Although I say you can't have consensus on a proposal you never make. So there's something kind of structurally wrong with that argument. Maybe if they had actually proposed something and couldn't reach a consensus on that, then they might have a case, although we don't even know what the threshold for consensus is. Is it a vote in the House of Commons? Is it a referendum? Is it how many retweets you get when you put it out on Twitter? We don't know. The government hasn't said. So there's an issue with saying that they don't have consensus when they haven't tried. But there's also an issue with the government who says, well, you know, we need to have consensus, whatever that means. I don't know if that means every Canadian in the country has to agree on one thing before we go ahead with it. They certainly didn't think they needed consensus to break promises. So it's an interesting inversion, Mr. Speaker. I think if you were to go and talk to most Canadians, what they would say is that a government can go ahead and implement their election promises that they have a mandate to implement. And if they want to break those promises, then they should be looking for consensus from Canadians to say, yeah, you know what, something has changed since the election, something has changed since I decided to cast my ballot for you, and so I agree that you need to break this promise. No, instead, they're going around breaking promises all over the place without consensus, and then saying they need consensus just to keep the promises they made during the election. I mean, I can't be the only one who thinks that's completely backwards, Mr. Speaker. So, for instance, when they said they wouldn't approve new pipelines without a new process, and then went ahead and approved up to at least 3 pipelines under the old Harper process that they ran against, that to me seems like something they might have sought consensus for, Mr. Speaker. I don't think they would have found it. I don't think they would have found it if they had sought consensus on that, but they don't think they need consensus to break their promises, only to keep them, Mr. Speaker. They didn't seek consensus when they launched an attack on defined benefit pensions in this country by tabling Bill C-27, and that wasn't even an election commitment, Mr. Speaker. So this idea that somehow they're bound by consensus is ridiculous. If they really felt that they needed consensus by Canadians to move forward with important initiatives, then they'd do that, particularly in the context where they're breaking promises. So that was laughable, Mr. Speaker. I don't think anyone in Canada is buying the idea that simply because there wasn't consensus when the government never even so much as tried to build it around a particular proposal, that somehow that's an excuse for breaking a cut and dry promise. So then there was the leak to the Huffington Post that, well, you know, maybe this wasn't about the lack of consensus. Maybe this was about the growing threat of the alt-right. And this was really about Prime Minister Trudeau, you know, standing up against the alt-right and making sure they couldn't sneak in. But the fact of the matter is, and you know, members have said it before,
I believe a point of order was made by the honourable member for Ajax, and I have to admit that I heard it too. We're not allowed to name the members in the House, and I believe the honourable member, not on purpose, but mentioned the Prime Minister's name as opposed to referring to the Prime Minister.
My apologies. My passion for the issue got the better of me on that, Mr. Speaker. If the government kept its promises, I would be less inclined to name them in the House. So that's what we heard, was that this was really about defending Canadians about the alt-right, except that we know in the South, we just got one of the alt-right guys in there under a first-past-the-post system. And we also know that the government that the Prime Minister was so keen to say Canadians didn't like and didn't want, and was the reason for which we needed a changed voting system, got in under the first-past-the-post system. And mark my words, Mr. Speaker, when this Prime Minister is gone, and it may not take as long as they think, and the next right-wing Prime Minister gets in here in Canada with less than 40% of the vote, that will be on this Prime Minister's head. Shame on them. Let's hear the apology.
Comments? L'honorable député de Pierrefonds.
The honourable member for Pierrefonds.
I'm struggling to
reconcile the difference between what I found when I did my consultations, and I did not find any consensus, and when we listen to our members across the aisle, it's very clear that they found consensus. So, what do we know for sure? We know that there has been a number of referendums in different provinces across our country where they've sought to change the system. We've had the referendum in Ontario where mixed member proportional was proposed. 2/3 voted against it. Fair enough. We had a different referendum for single transferable vote in British Columbia. 40% said yes to single transferable vote, 60% said no thank you. Just last year in Prince Edward Island, they did a plebiscite. Let's open it up and hear what everybody thinks. Well, 22% wanted dual members. Mixed member got, let me get it here, mixed member got 29%, and first past the post got 31%. So, I was not able to find consensus in my riding. They seemed, in all of their ridings, to find a very strong consensus. We have a disagreement there. How do we reconcile that with what we know took place with all these different referendums? And what leads you to believe today that you're correct to see there is suddenly this great consensus?
I'm sure the honourable member isn't seeking my opinion. I'm sure he means the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona, so we'll let him go ahead.
My honourable colleague, in the first referendum in BC, actually 58% of the people voted for change, but the government had set an artificial supermajority, and so that's why the first referendum in BC failed. In PEI, the reason why you had such low thresholds, and he's quoting people's first preference, is because they had an alternate ballot, Mr. Speaker, and the result of that referendum was actually a call for proportional representation, mixed member proportional representation, which that Liberal government in PEI decided to ignore. So there are actually some similarities. It's not in respect to what people want. It's the behavior of Liberal governments. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, part of my speech, if the member was listening, was that the idea that somehow we need a unanimous consensus in order to proceed with electoral reform, when that was not the promise of the government. They didn't say, we're going to go out and we're going to get every Canadian to agree on the exact same system and then move forward with change. They said, we're trying to build a mandate to change the system. They got it. Over 60% of Canadians voted for a party in the last election that said we need to change the system. So enough with the red herrings. Let's get on with the apology.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague down the way here for his passion on this issue. And I know in the last election, many people in my riding, people who traditionally voted NDP and Green because of a clear promise made by the Prime Minister on electoral reform, they voted Liberal. And you know, I would never say it or infer it in this House, Mr. Speaker, but there's a lot of Canadians out there, including in my riding, that feel that they were deliberately lied to. So my question to the member is, does he think that the Prime Minister deliberately lied to Canadians?
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, as I said, I mean, this has been a tumultuous process since the last election, and there have been times where it really did seem like the government was trying to maneuver out of its promise early on. I would say due to the good work of opposition parties who thought that the government shouldn't be able to easily abandon its promises to Canadians, we were able to work together, even though there were some pretty serious disagreements, on a path forward to get a concrete proposal, one that respected what Canadians told the committee in terms of what they want, one that respected what experts testified was best for Canada, and then we came up with a proposal on how to move forward on a process. So we've got a situation here where the opposition parties together have provided far more leadership on the government's campaign promise than the government itself. If in that context a government can't find a way to keep its own promise, I don't know in what context they possibly could. So I'm not at liberty to say whether someone lied or not in this House, but Canadians can draw conclusions from the facts. They're compelling. Thank you.